So we are back with Roy Macintyre, and this time we'll be talking about 43 Fighter Squadron, aka the Fighting Cocks. So Roy, can you tell us a bit about their squadron and share some of your stories from your time there?
Yeah, it's great to be back on Aircrew Interview again, and particularly for me to be talking about my favourite squadron, my squadron, 43 Squadron. Why is it my squadron? Well, the squadron was formed in 1916 in Stirling, right in the shadow of Stirling Castle. It was actually a detached flight that had come down from Montrose, I think it was, and Sholto Douglas was tasked with forming this new squadron, obviously in the middle of World War One, and it stood up at Falloninch Farm, which is right on the edge of the M9 as it goes past northbound, past Stirling Castle. The fields there, and we've now got a memorial to mark the formation of the squadron. Right, that's the squadron at Stirling. Why is it linked to me? I was born in Stirling and I was raised there. So really, when I was growing up at school, I knew that I wanted to join the RAF. I knew I wanted to be an RAF pilot. I didn't appreciate how difficult it was going to be. But obviously, my orientation was towards 43 Squadron because it was a local squadron, just as somebody who's interested in joining the army from Stirling would be looking at their Argyll Southern Highlanders being the local regiment. 43, I discovered, was the local squadron. Although at the time there wasn't too much link between the squadron and the town. That changed in later years. So that's where I wanted to go. And in those days, when I'm thinking about wanting to be an RAF pilot while I was at school, they had got the Phantom at Leuchars. So it was fairly straightforward for me that I was going to be a 43 Squadron pilot flying the Phantoms from Leuchars. Yes, it was a very, very difficult road. And there was, as I said before, there were lots of 90-degree bends there and a big bucket full of luck in circumstances. But that's why I got so linked to 43. And I was lucky in as much as my first tour was as a pilot flying Phantoms on 43. But 40, good talk about 43 itself, and one of the most famous, I would argue, one of the most famous squadrons in the RAF, sadly not in existence at the moment, which is a very, very sore point with the association, which is a very strong association. I'm happen to be the treasurer of it, and we have Sir Simon Bryant as our president. But despite all the campaigning of all the senior officers that used to be on the squadron, it doesn't exist at the moment, and it's questionable whether it ever will. But as I say, it was one of the most famous squadrons, the Fighting Cocks. Right, so where did the Fighting Cocks come from? Well, I think it was probably in the 1920s. This is where my historic knowledge is getting a little bit thin. But at one point they were equipped with the Gloucester Gamecock, and in those days it was the days of the Hendon air shows and spectacular formation flying and all that sort of stuff. Yes, the other squadron at Leuchars, which I did do 7 years on, but I'm not going to mention the name on this particular segment, were famous for looping 22 Hunters at Farnborough in the 1950s. Back when 43 had the Gloucester Gamecock, they used to fly close formation, and they linked with ribbon. They would tie ribbons between the wingtips, which would snap quite easily, but the very fact they could get through a display and still have all the ribbons linking the aircraft intact showed how good their precision flying was. And that was principally at Hendon. Around about that time, the black and white checkers as a squadron marking appeared. Again, I'm not 100% certain as to the origin or how they came about, but it was all around that time. And then tied in with that and their displays, they got this nickname of the Gamecock, the Fighting Cocks, being a fighter squadron. And that's where it came from. And I know in the 1930s there was some formalisation of squadron badges that were eventually, through the heraldic system, authorised by the King. And 43 were given the Gamecock, or they chose the Gamecock. I'm not quite sure which way round it was, but they chose the Gamecock as their squadron emblem to go on the squadron crest. And that kind of cemented the Fighting Cocks nickname and tradition, really, and it went from there even after they re-equipped with from the Gamecock onto other aircraft. Of course, the squadron took a big part in the Battle of Britain and subsequent in World War II. They were down south, and there was a long association with Tangmere, and there's some elements of the squadron memorabilia now in the very good museum down at Tangmere, which is well worth a visit if you happen to be in that part of the country. Obviously, the links with Leuchars, they were at Drem as well for a while, I believe, as they were rotated in and out of the front line of the war as it developed. But they quite quickly developed a very strong reputation, very good reputation for performance in the war. And this is where I'm starting to get a little bit weak on what happened. But in the post-war period, there were periods of disbandment. They were flying the Hunter, I know that. They were out in the Middle East for quite a while during the Aden period when there was the unrest there. They worked quite closely with 8 Squadron, who were also flying Hunters at the time. And then as the Middle East situation started to calm down, they were disbanded again. But such was their reputation that they were never going to be off the centre of the stage for long. And it eventually came back to Leuchars, and they were the first squadron to take on the air defence role with the Phantom. Little bit convoluted there because they weren't the first Phantom squadron. They were the ground attack squadrons that were principally based at Coningsby and then subsequently out in Germany were the first ones to stand up with the FGR-2, or as the Americans would call it, the F4M. They had the F4K, which was the navalised version. It was principally for the naval squadrons that were going to be on Art Royal. It was going to be Eagle and potentially CV-01, all of which got, well, not all of which, apart from Art Royal, got knocked into touch. Eagle was never upgraded to take the Phantom. So it was just Art Royal and 892 Squadron, which was the squadron they had, was the only one that was going to operate off the carrier. The order, though, for F4Ks, and we called them FG1s because there's no reconnaissance element to it, there was some spare going, and so through the politics of the MOD, they decided to form a air defence squadron with that, and that was 43. So that's how we came about, and for a long time we were the only RAF squadron operating the FG1 out of Leuchars, and that's the 1969. And basically 43 were living at Leuchars then for the rest of their time, which came to an end in 2009. So there was a re-equipment to the Typhoon, but Leuchars was their home, and it still is their spiritual home, notwithstanding all the other places they'd been. So that's where they were, that's how they came to be at Leuchars, and one of the principal elements at the Battle of Britain at Home Day, which my dad used to take me to since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and that's how I latched on to Stirling Squadron, which was relatively close to us in Stirling. Leuchars being about 50 miles away. And that's where my link to the squad. I just looked at the guys wearing the black and white checkered scarves and thought, that's me, I want to do that. Particularly since they flew Phantoms, because I thought the Phantom at the time was just gorgeous aircraft. And yeah, eventually did. I think I've told the story before on one of your other interviews, how it was a bit of luck and circumstance that got me to 43. I was originally posted to 56, the Firebirds down at Wattisham, coming out of the OC, but managed to swing it with one of the other guys who was up at Leuchars and didn't want to be there. And so I arrived on the squadron in 1986, and I thought, this is just perfect. The Phantom was difficult to fly, but by the time I got to Leuchars, I was starting to enjoy it. I was starting to really get a grip of it and starting to master it a bit, certainly in terms of flying, manoeuvring it, etc., etc. Still had a lot to learn about intercepts and what the radar was doing and all that, but that was going to come. I had a great time at Leuchars. It was hard work. It was still Cold War days. We had a lot of 3-day lock-ins, exercises, where we're working under NBC conditions. But no, we had a great time. Lots of little incidents and what have you that I can remember. The first one was, in those days, we still used the short runway, runway 23. It might have been, it then moved to 22 as the magnetic north rotates round. But in those days, it was designated 23. And I remember coming back with my navigator was Steve Green. We'd been off on a basic intercept, and we started to hear messages coming through to Buchan, who we're operating with, that there was problems back at Leuchars. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, that unit on the south side of the runway had managed to put one Phantom in the approach end cable on 27, and then managed to put, because they were so short of fuel, they were allowed to land another one in the opposite direction on the cable on 09.
Oh, wow.
So there was two Phantoms pointing each other, but the main runway was now out of use for some time. We're now coming back with diversion fuel, but Steve then said to me, he said, well, we could have a go at putting the aircraft into the PAG, which is the other cable, on runway 23. I went, okay, yep, sure. And he said, he looked at the fuel and he said, right, we'll have one go at this. And if you miss the cable, we're just going to keep rolling, get airborne, and go straight to Edinburgh, which was our diversion. And runway 23 was kind of pointing at Edinburgh. So it was always tailor-made. So he said, right, okay, the PAG's got quite a pullback on it, so be ready for that. And as we're downwind to land on runway 23, he said, oh, and by the way, Roy, how many approaches have you made to runway 23? I went, this is my first one. And there was an ominous silence from the back cockpit. And he goes, yep, this is definitely a one approach or we're off to Edinburgh. Fortunately, I managed to put it down into the cable. Yes, there was a pull, and we landed, and that was it. But I do remember that. Wow. It's been one of the early days. And the other one, which not really to do with flying, was first time out in Cyprus, of which there was many occasions. And I got to start. Great to be able to get a go of using the gun, the Gatling gun, that's the Vulcan gun under the 6-barreled monster that's in a pod. We had it as a Su-23 pod on the centre line, but the rate of fire was just huge. Not super accurate, but you know what? It didn't really matter when you're putting 6,000 rounds a minute out the front.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a bit like a garden hose. You're going to get the target wet by just throwing it around a little bit. And some of the experienced Phantom operators would say, oh, yes, well, you come in, you feed in a little bit of rudder, you do that. Like, no, you've got it's like a fire hose on full belt. You're going to hit the target if you get it in the general area, and that's generally what happened. Anyway, that was the reason we're out in Cyprus. But my very first first night out there, the squadron went down to the Akrotiri village, which is just outside the main gate, for a first night kebab, as you do. And things took their normal course. And I will admit to being on top of the bus roof coming back into the camp. Why? Because it seemed like a good idea at the time. There was a couple of other guys who had climbed up on top of us, and we were surfing as it's driving along, standing out. Totally stupid. And then, of course, we all fall flat on our faces on the roof when we got to the main gate, going shh, shh, shh. Because obviously the security guy couldn't hear us going shh, shh, shh on top. And he goes inside, who is it, blah, blah, blah. And he said to the guy, whoever the senior officer was, and how many are on the roof? And he goes,
did he really?
Yeah, fine. So we then got through the gate and on, driving to the mess, and immediately we're away from the floodlights. We're standing up, go, we got past the picket post, do that. Anyway, get to the mess, and somebody had shut the window that I'd climbed out of. And so the only way to get down was to jump off the roof of the bus.
God.
Which again seemed like a good idea at the time, because I needed to get into the bar to continue the evening. It was a long way down, and I landed like a sack of potatoes. I ripped both trousers, my knees in my trousers. My leg hurt, but somebody picked me up and said, "Oh, Roy, you'll be fine, you'll be fine." Dragged me in, we sat down, and after a while, I appeared to be fine. What then happened later on that night is, you could probably, I needed to pay a visit in the middle of the night. And having gone into the ablutions, I turned to face the apparatus and I slipped and went face first onto the cistern, and the flush handle on the cistern caught me just underneath the eye. I then sat back and sit on the floor, and I went, I had enough about me to go, that was remarkably stupid. Oh, that hurts a wee bit. And I put my hand up to my cheek, brought my hand out, yes, there's blood. And I thought, oh, heck. Anyway, went back to bed. In the morning, the sheets were a bit red anyway, went back downstairs, and the first person that saw me went, "Oh my God, you need to go to the medical centre," because my cheek had gone out. I wasn't sure if I'd broken my cheek or whatever. In actual fact, it was just a couple of stitches to sort the cut out, but I had just a complete mess, and I thought, gosh, this is life on 43 Squadron. I am not going to survive this tour. I'm going to be completely wrecked. Of course, that was just first night madness, and it disappeared. And a day or two later, I was able to put my oxygen mask on and actually go flying. Although initially the boss wasn't too impressed. I think secretly he thought, yeah, that's one of my lads' first night. Well done, Tech. Without having too much serious damage. And of course, the other bit on 43, the reason we were there was not Cyprus, but at Leuchars was Northern QRA, which is what it was all about. And again, probably one of the most memorable events was my first QRA launch for real. We had a no-notice one, which was a start attack eval at 5 o'clock in the morning. We got launched, and there was nothing for us to do, and we sat for 2 hours going round and round in circles, burning fuel down until we could land, and then we were released to go home. So that was a disappointment. But for real, the launch was a Friday afternoon, and the weather wasn't brilliant, but myself and Squad Leader Westcott was the navigator. We got launched up. There was an E3, an A2 E3 in support. They had launched the Victor tanker in those days, because it was 1987, I think this happened. So that came out of Marham. And eventually we broke cloud and intercepted 2 Bear Charlies, which was very impressive to see these things up close and hear them as well, because you can hear them. They're quite loud. With them, following them for a little while. This was up north of the Shetlands, between the Shetlands and Faroes, the Shetlands-Faroes Gap. And then after about 10 or 15 minutes with them, we were broken off and told to investigate another contact that the E3 had picked up. And this was a Bear Delta, which was not super close to the other two, but in the general area. So in that one trip, which was about 4 hours long, 3.5, 4 hours, picked up the first 3 bears. And then to cap it all, because I'd flown for 4 hours, the flight commander, Squad Leader Cliff, who was in charge of the QRA that day, his very words to me, he said, "Well, if we get launched again, you'll be grounded. So you're no use to me now. I'm going to call in the Q3 pilot to take over." So that was Friday afternoon. Me flying in by 5 o'clock. I was in the bar telling stories all about it. It couldn't have worked out anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before you go on there, is that quite rare getting 3 bears in one day back in them days?
Well, a lottery in those days. It was just starting to tail off at the end of the Cold War. If I'd joined the squadron about 3 or 4 years earlier, you would have been almost guaranteed to get a Q or 2 Q launches a week, and there would have been something on it. Now, what it would be, maybe 2 aircraft, usually 1 or 2. It'd be rare to pick up 3, but occasionally, if they were having an exercise, practicing missile launch profiles, etc., you could have a whole stream of them, and it has been known for people to get 4, 5, 6.
Wow.
Unusual, more likely to be one or two. And I do recall one Friday night where that happened. When I joined the squadron, so this story was told to me, but everybody's in happy hour, and suddenly the boss of the squadron boss appears and starts tapping his crews on the shoulders. And how many drinks have you had? How many drinks have you had? And then well, this is my first one. It says, right, don't drink anymore. You're now going to be Q5. Now, the Q crews are numbered. 1 and 2 are the two that are in the shed and are on 10 minutes notice. Q3 is on 60 minutes notice, as is their aircraft. And then beyond that, they will generate them in numerical order on varying levels of readiness. And what had happened was that day, a lot of activity had happened. They had launched aircraft. And yes, while they would normally try and recycle them, i.e., one up, send the other one back to refuel and get going and get prep to be launched again. If there were more targets in the area that required them to keep the aircraft up, first thing they could do is ask for help from Southern Q to Coningsby. They've got a longer transit time. But the other thing they would do is start to generate more aircraft from Leuchars, and that's what they were doing on this particular night or evening. And the boss was just struggling to find people to man up the aircraft. And I can't remember whether they got to Q6 or Q7, but that was a fairly unique situation and they're fairly rare, it must be said. But no, Q was all about, and it became more prized during my time on the squadron because it started to die down and was less common. Whereas certainly in the early 80s, it was, we got launched again. Saw Russians, there we go, the Soviets, as it was then. But no, it was good.
Yeah, so obviously you got your Phantom time there, but you also went back on the F3 with 43. Can you tell us a bit about that? And what was it? What was the differences like from going from one aircraft to the other, and also the mentality of the squadron then times?
Yeah, I ended up down at Coningsby, Leeming and then Coningsby when I went on to the F3. I only got a year and a half on Phantoms at Leuchars. Why? He's just said he wanted to be there. Why, etc. Well, the reason, and I have mentioned before, is that when I got the chance to transfer onto the F3, I knew that was the future, so I wasn't going to pass it up because I didn't know when the next opportunity was going to be there, and I didn't want to get left behind on the new aircraft. So it was only a year and a half, and then I'm on the F3. Initially at Leeming, then down at Coningsby. Ended up spending 7 years at Coningsby. The final 4 as a qualified weapons instructor on the F3 Operational Evaluation Unit. A great tour, but I always had an eye looking north, thinking I really would like to get back up to Leuchars and onto the front line, and on the front line that means 43 for me. And I started to watch the postings of the QY pilots, and one was coming up, the 43 one was coming up, spoke to the individual concerned, and we again kind of arranged between us a swap and then put it to the powers that be, and it happened. So the guy I replaced at 43 came down, took my job at Coningsby, I went back to 43. Went back to the same HAS site. We're in the Northern HAS site, so not much changed there. Very familiar. The mess was still there. A lot of the staff was the same. It was feeling very much like coming back home. Yeah, different aircraft, slightly different operating procedures, and mostly different personnel. Though there was one or two who had, both on the ground crew and the aircrew side, who had transferred from Phantom 43 to Treble 1, I've said, 43 Tornadoes. So in that respect, it was quite an easy transition. It was easy for me because I knew how to operate out of Leuchars, and I knew how to operate the F3. It was more just getting meshed in with how 43 did the fine details of how they went about their business, and of course the personalities that were on the squadron. By now, there was a lot more cross-runway posting. By that, I mean, back in in F4 days, you hardly ever got anybody coming from the dark side onto 43, and similarly 43 going south of the runway. Generally, if you were posted away from the base. The pros and cons, I think there were more cons than pros, in as much as we didn't really mesh superbly as a wing on exercise. That changed completely with the F3. There was much more cross-runway posting, and we had common standard operating procedures. You think standard operating procedures should be standard? Well, within bases, not necessarily. Little things that could often trip you up, but we got what we call wing SOPs, and so we could operate quite seamlessly, and that amplified our capabilities in terms of doing the job. The other thing that came out of that with these cross postings is you got to know the other squadron a lot better, and in the mess things got a lot better. They were a lot more sociable. Because I think I mentioned before, in F4 days, my Phantom days, it was tribal in the mess, particularly Happer. I mean, it was Rangers Celtic, Liverpool Everton, you name it, Man City, Man United. It was that hard. Whereas in the F3 days, we were a lot more happier to socially mix, because the unit identity was still there, but we had this wing concept, and that helped to smooth things over. Having said that, one thing I did notice when I came back, so I left in 88 and I came back in 97, so 9 years on 43, nobody was wearing black and white checkered scarves. And I thought, oh, so much so that I had to ask one of the flight commanders, is the rule come out that we've not to wear these anymore? And they went, no, just nobody's really thought about it. Right, get into the cupboard, get my scarf on, start wearing it. And I did manage to get them to quite a few of the guys to start wearing the black and white checkered scarves again. And I think it was more symptomatic of this wing concept, which had slightly eroded the individual squadron identity to more the Leuchars wing. Now, I'm not saying it had destroyed it completely. It had just taken the need and maybe the strength of feeling of the squadron identity out of it a bit. And with the changeover of people, it started to just fade into the background. Now, I'm not saying it was a bad thing. But it was just the way I am. It's 43, black and white checkers. There we go. And I wasn't leading any fights in the bar or anything like that. But it was just to bring the feeling of the squadron identity back, which I did for a while. And then again, it seems to be a trend. Somebody was trying to tell me something again about a year and a half on the squadron, and then I was posted because they needed to put a new QY pilot in to 43, so that they had just come off the course, and he needed somewhere to go, and there was a slot on the other side of the runway, and that's where I then spent 7 years, which we'll just gloss over, where the colours changed from black and white to black and gold, and suddenly I was like a politician that had suddenly going into power, criticising the opposition, and now suddenly it was me, and it's all different now. Yeah. But I saw from the other side that, again, we continued to work well as a wing. And I believe that continued on to the Typhoon, because I eventually left Leuchars just as the Typhoons were coming into service and before either of the F3 squadrons at Leuchars disbanded. In fact, I left Leuchars about 4 months before 43 disbanded. By that stage, I was on the OCU 56 squadron, which had moved up to Leuchars. So I didn't get to see the end of the two frontline squadrons as such. But I do believe that they still continue to work well as a wing. Very sorry to see the squadron disbanded, not least because just days before the last F3 accident occurred, and it was a 43 squadron jet over on the west coast of Scotland, low level, where the aircraft, it was heavy, with the big tanks on, taking a turn through a glen, and it just didn't make the radius that was required to get cleanly through the glen, and it hit belly up the mountainside, killing the two crew, which was tragic at any time. But just as the squadron was trying to hold a disbandment parade weeks later, it was awful. The worst way for a squadron to finish, and I say finish, there was all talk about which squadron number plate was going to happen with the Typhoon. It's very easy to see how it's gone. The official policy was we wanted to keep the low numbers, and supposedly there is a formula to dictate which number plates go, but you can't help but see that there's an awful lot of GR squadrons, and all the Jaguar number plates still exist. So Coltishall, Marham, and a lot of the Germany GR number plates have all survived in one form or another, not necessarily Typhoon, but in one form or another. And there's air defence squadrons, well, 5, I'm not sure, there's 5 still exists at Waddington, but 11, 29.
Wasn't 5 like an AWACS squadron or something?
Yeah, they were at Waddington with the
Sentinel,
Shadow,
wasn't it?
Sentinel. So I know they were on a finite life, but you have to start thinking, where's the air defence squad? And it's obvious that the mud movers, ex-mud moving bosses up on the powers that be, ensured their number plates survived, and the air defence ones withered. And yet both Leuchars air defence squadrons are no more. And I know that I think just recently the Treble One standard was moved from Chom, where it's like a holding point on the rotunda at College Hall. It was laid up St Clement's Dane in London, I think. I know 74s was moved there. 43s went to the last one went to Stirling. The one before that, St Giles. You get a new standard every 25 years. Both squadrons if they reform, would get a new standard anyway. But generally, when you lay a standard up in a church, you're accepting that is full stop. It's not always, but it generally is. And so, even with the latest announcement that possibly F-35As coming in, etc., you think, well, that'll be another squadron. I'm not holding my breath, to be honest. There'll be another ground attack squadron number plate waiting to come out to replace them. So I think, unfortunately, 43, the Fighting Cocks days are over. As I say, we've got an association. We have an annual reunion every year. We've just had it down in the RAF Club in London. Next year, we're hoping to go back to the mess at Leuchars, which is great, back home. But it's a fact of nature that every year our numbers are getting less. We don't have the squadron. We don't have new recruits coming in who want to join. It is now a finite number. And as every year goes past, we get less. It's a bit like every other military association. So in that respect, it's a little bit sobering. But regret anything? No, well, maybe jumping off the bus. But otherwise, no, it was brilliant. And 43 will always be, there.
Yeah.
For fantastic.
So you loved. So do you always associate Leuchars with 43?
Yeah. I mean, I have lots of other squadrons and patches, etc., that I've been on, etc. But I could count 3 tours on 43 because I did come back. 43 became the OCU right at the end.
Yeah.
So I did, when I left the force, I was back on 43 again for a short tour for the time. I never really had much more than a year and a half. And finally, my postscript wasn't quite the squadron's postscript, but my last trip on 43 was leading a 4-ship flypast over the squadron parade, who were exercising their right to the freedom of the city of Stirling. So they were on parade just below the castle, and I took the 4-ship over the top. My squadron, my town. last trip. And that night, we had a dining-in night in the castle. It was just perfect. And the boss couldn't have arranged something for me like that any better. Absolutely perfect finish for me. And the jet that I flew, ZE Zulu Echo 887, is the one that's sitting in the RAF Museum now. So when I'm down in London, two old codgers can stand together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Roy, thank you very much for coming back on the show and sharing your time on 43. But yeah, what have you been up to since we last spoke? Anything in the works or keeping busy still?
I am continuing to be a volunteer signaller on the Mid-Norfolk Railway, which I thoroughly enjoy. I'm now the Deputy Signalling Inspector, which means I'm training up new guys coming in. That's about 3 years now I've been doing that. And also, because I'm a keen photographer, I'm doing quite a lot of photography for them, both just a general interest on their Facebook pages, etc., as well as advertising. There's quite a few of my pictures now are used on their brochures, etc., etc. And in fact, the Durham, which is the main town that the railway operates from, they're producing a calendar this year around Durham, and on the front cover is one of the photographs from the railway, which I was quite pleased with. So that's taking up most of my time, and still enjoying the railway and enjoying good health, which is always the main thing. But no, life is good.
And I've got one final question. We got one from a viewer, and he said, where is it here? Roy, are you going to get to any air shows this year?
Oh, now that's a good one. The two obvious ones, I say obvious, are certainly not going down to Riyadh. Riyadh's just too far for me in terms of the effort to get there for my interest. But certainly Duxford I get down to quite regularly. And Shuttleworth's not that far away. And my wife has never been to Old Warden, so that's definitely one we'll probably try and get to, one of their air shows during this summer. Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Well, Roy, thank you very much for coming on the show.
No bother. Thank you for inviting me on. Cheers.
Cheers.